Hello, everyone. My name is Lauren Freed, and I am here to present the Readiness Reset, Sleep, Stress, and Pain Management for Tactical Performance. This presentation was initially presented at the Tactical and Occupational Performance Conference, also known as TOPCON, hosted by Georgia Southern University. I initially presented this on Tuesday, June 16, 2026, to 48 attendees, including active duty service members, firefighters, police officers, and professionals working in the tactical field, including physical therapists, athletic trainers, occupational therapists, strength and conditioning coaches, personal trainers, health coaches, registered dietitians, professors and researchers, and mental health performance coaches and therapists. So I will take you through that presentation. I first started off with a question for the group to have them think about the last 7 days. Which of these was the biggest readiness limiter for them? And then I had them raise their hand if it was sleep, raise their hand if it was stress, raise their hand if it was pain, and then raise their hand if it was a mixture of all three that impacted their readiness. And with that, I also noted that it is important to pay attention to what their answers were for this as we go through the presentation to see how those elements might have impacted their readiness in the past 7 days, but also well before and well after that. So starting off with a roadmap. During this session, we're going to go through 5 different parts. The first part is going to be identifying why readiness matters. We're going to talk about the impact of sleep, stress, and pain on musculoskeletal injuries and overall readiness for our tactical operators. We will then go into part 2 on sleep, talk about some of the sleep science and also some strategies for better sleep. Go into part 3, talking about stress, recognizing how stress impacts the body. Then going into pain, talk about some pain science and also impact on performance. And then finally, we will close it all up through the integration of these 3 pillars on sleep, stress, and pain. And then finally with some key takeaways that will be helpful. So in our first part, we will discuss why readiness matters. And I want us to start by identifying what readiness means. So we know that readiness is a consistent word that is used among the tactical population. And I want to create a definition so we understand what I mean by readiness throughout this presentation. So I identified readiness as the ability to perform, recover, and adapt physically, emotionally, and cognitively. I wanted to put a holistic piece on this because I know with a lot of individuals who are working in the physical setting that are in this room that we also want to identify the emotional and cognitive piece that we have as part of readiness. So I also want to note that performance is limited by capacity and not necessarily effort. It is not just a physical component, it's a component of all things encompassed together that's going to support our overall readiness. So discussing the readiness problem. We're going to chat about military, firefighters, and then police officers. So I want us to set the ground to make sure that we're in understanding of the larger impact that we are having. So for military personnel, it is found that 60% sleep less than 6 hours per night. The interesting part about this statistic is that regardless of how far out somebody is from a deployment, potentially into retirement, it still has the same impact on service members. So they are traditionally, even in their veteran years, still sleeping typically less than 6 hours per night. And then also in this, we looked at the deployed setting, which there's about 42% of individuals that are sleeping less than 5 hours per night, 15% of individuals that are sleeping less than 4.5 hours per night, which is very concerning. But the bigger part of all of this is that sleep has also had a tremendous impact then on the injury piece, with 84% of all injuries in military personnel being musculoskeletal related. Unfortunately, most of these injuries are actually preventable through behavior change. So you'll see that I highlighted the same thing for the next 2 as well. So for firefighters, we have the 84% of firefighters were classified as poor sleepers on duty. The interesting thing about firefighters, which is different in the research from the military personnel, is that once they were off duty, we had a little over half at 53% still being identified or classified as poor sleepers off duty, but that leaves a fairly high percentage of individuals being good sleepers while on duty or off duty. So we want to note that there might not be as large of an impact that they're seeing in research as deployments are having on service members. And then the other part of this is that 47% of all injuries are classified as musculoskeletal injuries for firefighters. And I will say a lot of the research shows that a lot of the injuries are more related to actual physical injuries, like something happening, not necessarily musculoskeletal relating. So something happens on the job site, in training, etc., etc. The last part is for police officers. So 51% of police officers reported bad sleep quality, and 40% reported symptoms with at least one sleep disorder. So common sleep disorders have been insomnia for them, but there are some additional ones that show up. And then 38% of all injuries are musculoskeletal related. The biggest thing that they see for police officers is really into the night shifts and the occupational stress that those can have on somebody. And that's also very much the same for firefighters and military personnel, which we'll discuss as well. So with this identifying of these stats, I want us to anchor ourselves within this readiness model that I created for this presentation today. So at the top, we have sleep, pain, and stress all impacting each other. And then from there, we're going to go into performance and then overall readiness. So keep this in mind as we walk through the presentation. So going into our sleep. So why sleep matters? Sleep is a fundamental aspect of human life. I always love to talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. At the very bottom of the period of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we talk about the physiological need, and that is sleep. So if you look up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you will see on the newer models that they do have sleep in parentheses in that model. And it's because sleep is happening 1/3 of your life. So typically sleep occupies 20 to 40% of your day, and it is impacting how our brain works, how our body works, and how we perform. And because of that performance measure, that and the brain and body impact, that's why we want to dive into some of the sleep science and how it's truly impacting us and the way we recover. So starting off with the sleep-wake cycle, there are two different independent systems at play when we refer to sleep. And the first one is the sleep urge that is starting to decrease when we are sleeping because we are recovering our body. But then when we wake up and throughout the day, we want to build our sleep need and that sleep pressure. Because at the end of the day, which is where you see this highlighted on here, we want to have built our sleep pressure up to the top, so then we are back to needing that sleep urge. And we'll talk about how melatonin and cortisol impact this next. So as we know, our sleep need and sleep urge, melatonin and cortisol do have an impact on that piece. So in the morning time, when we first wake up, our cortisol is released into our body. So blue light also helps with its release, which is why typically in the evening time you hear stay away from blue light. It's because it does release a cortisol spike with it. But throughout the day, our cortisol begins to level off, which is when melatonin starts to enter our bloodstream. So that 2 p.m. crash that a lot of people have, which is then why they consume caffeine around that time, it's actually because our cortisol is beginning to lower and our melatonin is beginning to enter the bloodstream. So we do have a natural crash in our day. So as the melatonin enters our bloodstream, right, that's going to help with that sleep urge or build the sleep pressure, needing the sleep urge. And with that too, we always like to associate the orange and red lights. So think sunset is the best way to say it. But they do play off of each other. The interesting part about melatonin is that right, our body does naturally produce it. However, when we take melatonin supplements, we will, depending on how much melatonin somebody's taking in a evening and over time, it can cause our body to release less natural melatonin because our body is becoming dependent on it. So we do want to make sure that we are balancing the melatonin and cortisol inverse relationship with each other because they are naturally occurring hormones in our body. So the other thing that's important to understand with the sleep science is our true sleep cycle. So we identify our sleep cycle to have 4 different stages. Stage 1 is our non-REM stage, and this is our dozing stage. So when we think about doing a mindfulness activity, meditation, breath work, and we're still coherent and we can still pay attention and we're still connected with our minds and bodies, we might start to feel like that dozing piece depending on where we're at in the midst of that meditation. So this is that part. It's obviously very easy to wake somebody up from this stage, and it's typically only lasting 1 to 7 minutes. So it's pretty short. If somebody is not woken up in this stage, they will move into light sleep. So light sleep is our wind down stage. So during light sleep, this is when our body starts to bring down the temperature, our heart rate begins to lower, our sensory organs start to wind down. And in light sleep, we're there for about 10 to 25 minutes. However, I will say, which we'll show in the next slide, that you do spend about 50% throughout the night in light sleep. So light sleep is very important. But same thing, still pretty easy to wake somebody up in a light sleep stage. So if somebody is woken up at this time, they're normally naturally ready to go. However, if they're not, then they should move into deep sleep. And deep sleep, about 20 to 40 minutes, this is our mostly physically restorative area. So in deep sleep, our body is improving our immune function, we're having tissue repair and growth, and also during this, our body releases the growth hormone, which is going to help repair muscles, bones, and cells. And the other big process that happens in deep sleep is the cellular energy restores of ATP, which is prepping the body for the next day. So deep sleep is very important. And then finally, as we move through our last stage of sleep, which is REM, rapid eye movement, this is about 10 to 60 minutes in length. And this is where the cognitive and emotional regulation and restoration begins to happen. So I always say that this is where we start to cleanse everything in our brain that's been built up throughout the day, and we also start to move our short-term memories into long-term memories. So we definitely need to go through REM sleep. It's also the stage of sleep where a lot of problem solving and creativity happen, and also emotional regulation, energy balance, and then hormone secretion. So in this area is where metabolisms are typically restored and supported. So with these 4 stages, something that I do want to talk about is what it looks like throughout the night. So if you wear a wearable watch, ring, Whoop band, whatever it might be, this is typically what you're going to see when you look at your sleep data. So these stages throughout the night that we just talked about, as we said, light sleep will happen first. Somebody will go into, N1, the lightest amount of sleep, will happen first, non-REM area. And if somebody is not woken up into that, they will then move into stage 2, which is light sleep. So from here, we see that a sleep cycle then moves from deep sleep to REM sleep. Typically, these sleep cycles are going to be about 90 minutes in length. So we should have at least 4 of these a night, but ideally a few more. And with these, you'll see on this chart that throughout the evening time, deep sleep is heavier on the front end of these sleep cycles, and then it gets lighter on the second end, and REM flip-flops with that. So REM at the beginning, they're smaller, and then REM towards the end of the night are larger. So that is something that's happening on purpose with the way our body is processing things. But moving through these cycles, we'll see that typically deep sleep and REM sleep, we do spend about 25% of our sleep in each. And the one thing I want to highlight is that because these are 90-minute cycles, this is why whenever somebody asks about napping, we normally do say you want to nap for either less than 20 minutes or more than 90 minutes, because if you wake up in the middle of a sleep cycle within that deep sleep or REM sleep, a lot of times that's when you wake up super groggy and you feel like you're not awake because you're in a deeper sleep. So keeping that in mind when we're talking about napping. But the other thing I want to highlight with this is also in REM sleep, this is, as we know, known as rapid eye movement, and typically these are where the most vivid dreams are happening. However, a misconception is that we actually only dream during REM sleep, and that's not true. We do dream in other non-REM periods. It's just less common. So, an interesting fun fact on REM. So now that we understand sort of the sleep science and what's happening, something I really want to highlight is the restriction that sleep has with performance. So looking at this chart, as we know, 7 to 9 hours of optimal sleep is amazing for our cognitive function, our focus, our mood, our physical function, and just overall being able to perform at high levels. As we start to get less and less sleep, our ability to perform begins to go down. So at 6 hours, we start to have a measurable decline. We notice some drops in alertness, concentration, reaction time, decision making. At 5 hours, we end up getting worse, having major impairments on cognitive function, mood, coordination, safety. And in the military, there's a lot of research that actually shows that with less sleep, that's typically when those injuries are happening that aren't necessarily musculoskeletal and preventable. And that's the same thing with firefighters and police officers. So some of these injuries, unfortunately, can be fatal, and some can lead to unfortunate consequences, but that's why we want to make sure that we are getting enough sleep so accidents are not happening with less sleep. If it's preventable, that is ideally what we want to try to work towards. The other thing that's interesting about this, and you all might have heard this before, but with limited sleep and driving, they've actually done studies that show that having minimal sleep in your day can actually be a similar driving situation to blood alcohol levels. So they have found that people with limited sleep have actually caused more accidents than drunk driving. And that is very scary when you're thinking about individuals working multiple hour shifts, potentially not sleeping days on end, thinking about firefighters that are potentially on shift work, maybe military personnel that are on duty, police officers that have had to take extra shifts. So having people have multiple days in a row of limited sleep and then them finishing their final shift and driving home, and the impact that that might have on the road. So it's not necessarily just a concern at the workplace, but also sending the individuals off to go home and try to function in daily life. So some common tactical sleep challenges, these will not be a surprise to anyone, and some of these were mentioned earlier, but shift work is a big one. Overtime, especially from potentially having not enough staff. Night operations and calls, you see this a lot from deployed settings, and then also for firefighters and police officers. Hypervigilance, so even if you do have the ability to sleep, thinking about firefighters on duty, you finally have the ability to sleep at night, however, you're constantly wondering, are we going to get a call? So you're staying hypervigilant and not necessarily getting into those deep sleep or REM sleep cycles because you're always on high alert. And then lastly, sleep environments. As we know, these sleep environments might not be the greatest, especially for military personnel in deployed settings. There might be very noisy, too cold, too hot, maybe having areas where they have to be hypervigilant. They're always keeping an ear out, an eye out. So this can cause a lot of sleep issues just solely from an environmental standpoint. And then with this as well, we do know that there are some things that do impact our sleep. And I like to bring it back to that melatonin and cortisol, talking about the dip naturally. I know I mentioned it earlier, but caffeine. So as we know, we have cortisol dipping and we have our melatonin entering our bloodstream at about 2 p.m. And so a lot of times people drink caffeine at that point. And unfortunately, caffeine does have a half-life of 5 to 6 hours. So if you are consuming caffeine late in the evening, although caffeine stays in your body typically for 10 to 12 hours, it is going to have a high half-life. So somebody will probably not be able to wind down and go to bed because they're still going to have caffeine in their system. And I always say, not to be the bearer of bad news, but decaf coffee also has caffeine in it. So it is a much less amount than an energy drink or a cup of coffee or espresso, but it still does have caffeine. So it still potentially will keep you awake. So if we can prevent our caffeine consumption, consume your caffeine early in the morning, limit your caffeine intake, this will be something that is probably one of the easier behavior change factors that you're able to implement tomorrow and be able to help support your sleep in the long run. Other things that I want to highlight, nicotine. It does have a half-life of 2 hours. It stimulates your central nervous system. It can disrupt your REM because you're not going to sleep because your heart rate is high. Alcohol as well, typical half-life of 4 to 5 hours. Same thing, it does disrupt your REM sleep. And the interesting part too is that if you are somebody who does dive into your sleep and looking at like your charts through wearable technology, you will see that if you're consuming nicotine and alcohol super close to bedtime, a lot of times it takes a lot longer for your heart rate to begin to drop. So as we talked about earlier in the sleep cycles, normally in that light sleep area, that is when our heart rate begins to slow. However, with nicotine and alcohol, it causes our heart rate to still be high in light sleep and typically not to start to drop until deep sleep, which is going to impact that deep sleep cycle because we ideally should be in a very low heart rate during deep sleep and REM sleep. So something just to keep in mind. And then with cannabis, marijuana also does have a half-life of 2 to 8 hours, and it can delay your sleep onset. It reduces REM, and then sometimes also a tolerance builds, so then people will start consuming more of it. But the thing I want to really highlight with alcohol and cannabis is something that we call the REM rebound. So unfortunately, with these two substances, it begins to impact our REM sleep. So we typically see when talking to individuals about sleep, people will use alcohol and marijuana to not go through nightmares or night terrors. So they will take this as a way to cope with potentially PTSD and nightmares, night terrors that can be happening as a result of it, because it is going to suppress your dreams during REM sleep. The unfortunate part is, let's say that you do that for 10 plus years and you no longer are having nightmares or night terrors throughout REM sleep. You've suppressed those. When you then stop, you then have what we call a REM rebound. And ultimately, your brain has no idea how to process what just happened. So you are going to have even more vivid nightmares, night terrors, and it's going to be a crazy rebound because your mind is trying to process everything that you've suppressed for however many years you've been doing this. So that's the part that we then have to try to navigate because we need people to go through REM sleep. So we need to figure out how can we help with the symptoms prior to going into sleep. So one, somebody sleeps, but then they don't rely on substances to not go through these different sleep cycles. And we don't want someone to have to revert and go through something worse to try and get better. So if we can prevent those REM rebounds from ever happening, that's going to be ideal, but we also want to make sure people are going through all sleep cycles and remaining healthy. So now we're going to go into our part 3, which is on stress. So during this, I did run the group through a quick sympathetic versus parasympathetic breathwork session, and I had them place one hand over their chest and one hand on their stomach. And I did do this prior to showing them this slide, but the thing that I wanted them to note is if their chest was breathing or rising and lowering, or if their stomach was rising and lowering as they were breathing. And the reason that I like to do this activity is because that denotes if someone is typically in the sympathetic system or the parasympathetic system. And a lot of times we see with the tactical population that naturally a lot of people are chest and lung breathers, which notes that they're typically in a stage of fight or flight at any given point, and they're not going through that rest and digest section. So this is something very important for us to highlight because we ultimately should be going into rest and digest after something happens that puts us in fight or flight. So sympathetic nervous system is very important for us. This is going to help us stay alert. It is going to help us with stress, with danger. We need our bodies to react to fight or flight if we are in an emergency situation. During this, our heart rate increases, we have decreased digestion because we're going to other areas of the body that need support. We have pupil dilation, and obviously we are shallow breathing. Once that immediate stress, danger, physical exertion, whatever we go through ends, ideally we need to complete this cycle and go into a parasympathetic rest and digest. This is when we begin to get calm, we relax, we're back to safety, our heart rate's controlled, we have increased digestion, pupil constriction, and we're back to stomach breathing or diaphragmatic breathing. If we are always stuck in fight or flight, we are never going to have that sense of calmness, and that is going to typically, over a long period of time stuck in fight or flight, is going to typically increase our cortisol hormone levels, which then is going to impact our melatonin production and also our sleep cycles. So trying to come into a rest and digest setting is very important for us. The other thing that's interesting is the digestion marker. So for a lot of tactical population, we see that there are some digestive issues. A lot of times that can be because of always being in the fight or flight stage, and also having that decreased digestion and the mental health piece associated with it, because as we know, there is a very strong brain-gut connection leading to things like IBS. So it's good to understand the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems and be able to identify where we are currently at, because we should not always be in fight or flight mode. So what does this look like when we get to the human function curve? This has been in research for years. It is nothing new, but it is something I really like to talk about and identify, because the one thing to note, as we noted with fight or flight, we do have good stress and we do have bad stress or distress. So we need stress. Like we identified that fight or flight is a natural response. It's going to help us if there's a threat. It's going to help us through situations, but it is going to release cortisol and adrenaline because ultimately you're saving yourself from something, right? You're protecting yourself from something. However, if we don't get out of that fight or flight, this is when we can start to move into the exhaustion, the ill health, and the breakdown, because that arousal continues and our performance then is going to plummet. So we need good stress in our life. We do need to obviously have the saving piece, protecting ourselves, but there are also some good stressors like becoming a new parent, getting married, getting a promotion at a job, right? So there are good things that are going to happen to us that will cause some type of stressful response. Maybe because of the increased workload, maybe it's the first child, you're uneasy, you're not sure what's going to happen. Maybe it's the stress of wedding planning, right? There are going to be things that do happen, but those should be short-term things that are going to happen and then get into moving on with life and having fun and not being stressed out. So ultimately, if we can stay in this comfort zone area, that's going to be very good for our stress, and our body is going to adapt better to that. But the unfortunate part is that if we don't, and we get into that ill health pillar, this is where stress can stay within the body. And this is where we need to start to be mindful, because there are a lot of physical and emotional things that can come from held up stress in the body. So thinking about some highlighting things in being able to identify those, I always talk about stress and body mapping, because if we are cautious about what is happening, we can kind of associate that with, is this a stress response? Is this a pain response? Is this an injury that has happened? What is exactly happening to us that could be the cause of something greater? So on here, I did some stress mapping of the body just as an example. So let's say this person is having headaches. Maybe they have some tension in their shoulders, their neck, their upper back. A lot of people do carry a lot of stress in their shoulders and their upper neck. In their T-spine area, which a lot of times then leads to headaches. So maybe we're carrying a lot of stress here. Maybe the person has a generally super high heart rate. The interesting thing about heart rates that I like to say is know what your resting heart rate is when you wake up in the morning, because that will tell you so much about your health and recovery. If your resting heart rate when you're waking up in the morning, let's say, is typically around 48, 49, 50, in that range, and one morning you wake up and it's 58, your body probably is not truly recovered. So I always say heart rate is a really easy tool to be able to assess, am I recovering well? Am I maybe getting sick? What is happening? So if you're not somebody who takes your heart rate every morning and you generally know what your resting heart rate is, this is my encouragement to do so. It will tell you a lot. But let's say the person is having heart palpitations, a high heart rate, maybe digestive issues. We talked about the brain-gut connection, maybe just some tension in the lower back, different areas. We want to draw awareness to that and think, are some of these potentially related to stress? Are some of them potentially related to pain, which we'll talk about next? Or is it truly a physical injury that is impacting us and maybe related to arthritis or something in the past? So I encourage you all, if you have never done stress and body mapping, that this is something that you do, and you also encourage your people to do, just to identify areas that might be holding tension and stress in the body, which could then ultimately lead to a musculoskeletal injury that could have been preventable in the future. So with that, because these are tied together, we're going to go into part 4, which is on pain. So a little true or false that I asked the group: pain always equals tissue damage, true or false? The group answered false, which was correct and exciting. So diving into that a little bit more, we introduced the pain pathways. So our body has a system that we call central sensitization, and this is where we start to identify that some pain can be a structural problem, so something actually physically happens, but then we also have pain that is due to neural circuits in the brain firing or misfiring. So pain is generated by our subconscious brain, and we need pain similar to how we need stress. I always give the example that if you touch a hot stove, you will immediately remove your finger from that stove. That is our body sensing that there is pain and that the stove is hot. So we need to make sure that we do have some type of natural pain response. Pain doesn't equal damage, but it equals protection. So it is protecting us. However, as we see in this visual graphic, and also where we talk about the neural circuits in the brain firing or misfiring, ultimately, on the left-hand side, we have an acute pain. And then maybe that acute pain over time has turned into chronic pain because we have a knee injury or something has happened. The interesting part is that when the process of central sensitization happens, sometimes we can have misfiring of the brain and those neural circuits and pathways. So if our pathways or our neurons begin to misfire, this can actually cause us to have more pain in the body than might actually structurally being there. So our brain almost becomes overprotective of us and starts sending us messages of being in pain that we no longer need, which can make it hard for us to interpret and understand pain when we don't necessarily know what that looks like. So I always say, think of this example as a highway in a new city. So maybe when the city was first built, there was one highway leading in and out of it. And then as the city begins to grow, of course, with infrastructure, you're going to have now multiple highways that are built leading in and out of the city. And that's very similar with pain. As symptoms begin to develop and expand, it can be hard to pinpoint the location of the problem due to those multiple pathways that we see on the image on the right. So the more we can do to learn and unlearn our pain, the better we are going to be with being able to manage it. So I like to use the biopsychosocial factors and model when we begin to look at the reasoning behind our pain and how to manage our pain. So starting on the top left, we have some biological factors. These are things like true medical issues. So disease severity, the perception of pain, inflammation in the body, which can also be due to nutrition and lack of sleep, and how our brain is functioning and processing it. So these are the biological factors that are causing our pain. From there, you also have the impact of the psychological factors. So mood, anxiety, maybe the trauma, PTSD is a big one for our tactical population, stress, coping skills, emotions, attention, thoughts, feelings, all things that are impacting us. Then going into our social factors, thinking about the cultural factors, socioeconomic status, social support, maybe the social environment that we're actually in. So these things can all compound on one another and be associated with the chronic pain experience. And this is where being able to identify these three larger areas into smaller areas to see exactly how our pain is impacted by emotional, behavioral, and physical responses is huge. So being able to talk through these different processes and seeing, are we having physical and social impacts on pain, and are we perceiving different elements of pain because of these areas, will help us understand how we can support and treat to better ourselves from a holistic model. So putting this all together for our integration and closing in part 5, at the end of the day, we want to move the readiness cycle from negative to positive. So in the negative, we talked about poor sleep, higher stress, more pain, poor recovery, reduced performance. If we can shift that into having quality and quantity sleep, low stress, less pain, better recovery, higher performance, right? That is the optimum. That is where we are truly going to be ready and be able to perform our best. However, sometimes it can be hard, and we do need to focus on each area to get to where we are trying to go. So that's where we have tons and tons of practical strategies. So as we know, these are very much behavior-based practical strategies. We do know that sometimes there needs to be prescription medication that do play into this. So that's not mentioned here. And this is not to stop prescription medication if it's been prescribed or if there's certain things that the doctor has you on a regimen. But this is things that you can do in addition to that. So starting with anchoring sleep times and wake times. This is an area which is really important because a lot of times if we are working shifts or if we are having super late nights, early mornings, when we finally have off, people want to sleep in, right? This is where we try to prevent that, because if we can keep our body on generally a pretty good sleep cycle throughout days on end, our body will get into that better rhythm. So trying to anchor when we are going to sleep and when we are waking up. We typically say if you sleep in, try to keep it to like an hour difference, just because, as we said, we want to create those good habits with that sleep routine. From a bedtime routine and environment. I know we talked about earlier some of those barriers, and sometimes we cannot control the environment that we are in. However, when you are off duty and potentially in your home, these are the things that you want to begin to think about. So building that good bedtime routine, having a wind down hour, power down hour, turning off the electronics, the TV, not absorbing that blue light, as we know, it spikes your cortisol, maybe reading a book, journaling, talking to your spouse about your day, whatever it is at this point, starting to wind down on what you're doing, and then setting yourself up success from an environmental standpoint. So typically they do say the best sleep is normally when a room is 62 to 65 degrees. And I know some of you will not want to pay those electric bills, depending on where you are in the country. So that is something to be mindful of. But the cooler the environment in the room is, the better your sleep will be. Do not bill me your electric bills, but with that, thinking cool environment and having an environment that's inviting and safe. If you walk into your bedroom and you are automatically overwhelmed, you are not going to get good sleep because you are going to be hypervigilant. So keeping your environment clean, safe, inviting is going to be better for your sleep. The other thing that I do want to note is something that's interesting about bedtime routine, and also this does impact sleep and wake cycles as well, is that hot showers are actually really good at night and saunas are actually really good at night before bed, because your body will then try to cool itself down, right? And we want to cool down at bedtime versus vice versa. In the morning time, cold showers and ice baths are good because it wakes you up, because your body then is trying to heat up. So fun fact, dealing with those two, that can be beneficial. Other things, as we talked about before with building that sleep pressure, making sure we have exercise and movement throughout our day, but then also focusing on a warm up, a cool down, and then different modalities of training and also training variations. So switching up what we are doing, maybe strength training, maybe we're also then adding in some cardio of some sort. Maybe we're also adding in some paddleboarding, kayaking, hiking, something else in the summertime. But really being mindful of always making sure we're warming up, cooling down, and then changing our modality to truly increase that sleep pressure for us to then need to sleep at the end of the day. Other things, breath work, mindfulness, meditation, all great. Really good to be able to unwind at the end of the day as well, or if you have stressful situations throughout the day, resorting to these 3 items to then get you out of that fight or flight is also very beneficial and will help you go into rest and digest. Nutrition and supplements, we talked about that earlier. The supplement part, also being mindful of the nutrition piece, making sure that you're not having food super late around bedtime that are going to cause digestive distress. So being mindful of what you are eating. However, do not prevent yourself from eating before bed, because then you will be hungry and you will wake yourself up. So make sure you are getting food, make sure you're fueling your body well, obviously getting lots of water as well. Self-care is huge. A lot of times we will put self-care by the wayside. A lot of tactical personnel are very much givers and caregivers and very selfless. And I am encouraging you here to be selfish. So make sure you are taking care of yourself through self-care and finding something that you enjoy doing. So maybe that is massage therapy. Maybe it's going for a walk on the beach. Maybe it's unwinding through journaling prompts or gratitude, but finding something that is good for your self-care that's going to help you with your stress state. And then finally, alternative therapies. So yoga, massage therapy, I know I just mentioned, acupuncture, chiropractic care, anything that's going to help support you. There is a lot of research in those areas that it does help from a musculoskeletal injury prevention, a stress part, a pain part, and also a sleep part. But then also going into the mental health side of cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia is a gold standard for sleep support. Cognitive behavioral therapy for chronic pain is a gold standard for chronic pain support. And then also ACT, acceptance and commitment theory, is also another great one that we can use for supporting overall stress management, mental health, and how we support ourselves throughout the day. So I know this is a lot for practical strategies, The one thing I want to highlight is do not try to 360 and change everything at one time. Pick a few of these and find ones that are going to be manageable. Try those and then maybe add on in the future. So lastly, I do want to leave you with a readiness check-in card. This is something that you're able to do and also take back to your command, shops, units, teams, because this is a really good way to evaluate how you are doing as a check-in to then support what you need in the future. So I identified some different domains on the side, ranking from 1 being low to 5 being high on sleep quality, sleep quantity, two different things, energy levels, stress levels, pain, and focus. And I have on here that if 2 or more of the categories are low, ranging in that 1 to 2, what can you adjust to get to a 4 or 5? Is it your training? Is it maybe prioritizing recovery in that week? Is it stress management? Monitoring your heart rate. We talked about being able to do the easy heart rate test and see where you're at. I encourage you to keep this fairly consistent. You can use this as a daily check-in or multiple times a week, but I would keep consistent of where you're at and be honest with yourself to see how you can tailor this to what you need. So leaving you with some key takeaways. Biggest thing is that readiness determines performance. So train hard when you're ready, recover intentionally, and manage stress and pain strategically. You do not need to go 100 miles a minute at every given point. Be mindful when your body is telling you that you need that recovery and take it. You will be able to perform at your top performance, peak performance, when you are fully recovered, and make sure you are having those moments. So as a reminder, right, we know that readiness problems are not necessarily because of a physical aspect, but it is also because of how we're recovered mentally, physically, emotionally, cognitively, etc., etc. So be mindful of these things to help you. Lastly, these are a bunch of references that were used throughout this. And finally, huge thank you. If you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to reach out to me. But hopefully you are able to take something that you learned today and implement it into your personal life, but then also with those that you are working with on a day-to-day basis. And through those small behavior changes, you can ultimately set yourself up for better success, better readiness, and hopefully higher performance.